The gunshot was the only punctuation that mattered in the midday silence of Millfield. It cracked the placid air, followed by the sound of shattering glass that made the dust on the main street jump. Thorne Shepard, who had been negotiating the price of rock salt with a merchant whose face he couldn't be bothered to remember, felt the sound in his bones. It was a familiar, unwelcome echo from a life he had buried. Before the first scream, a second shot rang out, and the double doors of the Millfield Bank and Trust burst open. Two men spilled out their faces, obscured by grimy bandanas. They moved with a vicious economy, not the panicked energy of common thieves, but the cold precision of wolves. A third man followed, dragging the bank teller by his collar, using him as a shield before shoving him face first into the dirt. "Stay down, and you'll live to see supper," the leader barked, his voice a gravelly command that brooked no argument. He was a broad-shouldered man, his gun belt inlaid with tarnished silver conchos that caught the harsh sun. Thorne remained perfectly still, his body pressed against the rough-hewn timber of the general store. He was just a rancher buying supplies. A ghost. That's what he had become in the years since Margaret's death. But the ghost still had eyes, and his eyes were tracking the robbers' every move. They weren't just taking money bags. One of them, a wiry man with cruel, darting eyes, was moving along the line of terrified townspeople, yanking jewelry from women's ears and snatching watches from men's pockets. It was cruelty for its own sake, an assertion of power that turned Thorne's stomach. His hand twitched, an old instinct searching for the colt he no longer wore. He had made a promise standing over her grave. No more guns, no more violence. He was a man of peace, now tending a ranch that was slowly dying alongside his heart. The wiry robber approached him, his eyes lingering on Thorne's worn leather vest. Thorne had nothing of value. Nothing except the one thing he would die for. "What's this?" the man sneered, his foul breath washing over Thorne. His fingers hooked under the thin leather cord around Thorne's neck, a cord Thorne never took off. He pulled, and the object tucked beneath Thorne's shirt came free. It was a silver locket oval, and unadorned, its surface worn smooth by years of touch. It wasn't valuable to anyone but him. "Just an old piece of tin," Thorne said, his voice dangerously low. "Let it be." The man laughed, a dry, rattling sound. He held the locket up, squinting at it. With a flick of his thumbnail, he popped the clasp. Inside, protected by a tiny pane of glass, was a miniature portrait of Margaret. Her smile was soft, her eyes full of the light that Thorne had once believed could save the world. It was the last image ever made of her, painted by a traveling artist a month before the raid. The sight of her face exposed to this soulless man under the brutal sun felt like a physical violation. "Pretty thing," the robber rasped, his gaze lewd. He made a move to close it, then stopped. A wicked grin spread across his face. With deliberate, agonizing slowness, he pressed his thumb against the delicate portrait, smudging the paint and cracking the glass. Then, with a final brutal snap, he broke the cord and shoved the locket into his pocket. Something inside Thorne, something he had kept chained and starved for 2 years, broke free. The world narrowed to the grimy thumbprint on his wife's face, to the sound of her memory being desecrated. The promise he had made shattered like the glass in the locket. He moved. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a pure animal reflex. His hand shot out, grabbing the robber's wrist with a grip of forged steel. The man cried out in surprise and pain as Thorne twisted. Bones grated. The robber's pistol clattered to the dust. "Give it back," Thorne snarled, his voice a stranger to his own ears. The leader with the silver-inlaid belt turned, his eyes widening in surprise at the sudden resistance. He raised his pistol. "Let him go, farmer." But Thorne wasn't a farmer anymore. He was the man. Margaret had married the man who had once been known by another name in other territories. He drove his knee into the wiry man's gut, snatched the locket from his pocket as he doubled over and shoved him into the path of the leader's aim. The leader hesitated for a fraction of a second, unwilling to shoot his own man. It was all the time Thorn needed. He dove behind a water trough as a bullet splintered the wood where his head had been. The robbers, their routine disrupted, scrambled for their horses. They fired wildly into the street, not aiming to kill, but to sow chaos for their escape. Thorn lay in the dirt, clutching the locket, his knuckles white. The glass was shattered, the portrait of his wife defaced by a greasy smudge. He heard the thunder of hooves fading into the distance. The townspeople were stirring, whimpering, someone calling for the sheriff. But Thorn heard none of it. He only heard the roaring in his ears, the sound of a carefully constructed dam of grief and regret bursting apart. He had let them go. He had held the memory of his wife in his hand and let her killers ride away. He had failed her. Again. The silence on Thorn Shepherd's ranch was a physical weight. It pressed down from the vast, indifferent sky and rose up from the thirsty earth. His land, once a testament to shared dreams, was now a monument to his neglect. The fence line sagged in the south pasture, a patient surrender to the elements. The wildflowers Margaret had planted along the porch were choked by thistle and dust, their vibrant colors a faint ghostly memory. The ranch was decaying, mirroring the slow rot of his own spirit. He sat on the porch steps at the desecrated locket, heavy in his palm. He had spent an hour trying to clean the smudge from Margaret's portrait, but the oil from the robber's thumb had soaked into the delicate paint, leaving a permanent, ugly stain across her smile. It was a fitting symbol for his own guilt, a mark that could never be erased. Inside the house, dust motes danced in the slivers of afternoon light, settling like a fine gray shroud over Margaret's belongings. Her worn copy of Leaves of Grass sat on the nightstand, a pressed bluebonnet still marking her favorite page. The piano in the corner stood silent, its keys yellowing, untouched since the day she died. The entire house was a museum of a life that had ended too soon, and he was its sole haunted curator. He looked out at the landscape, at the blood-red mesas, watching him like silent judges. This was the land she had loved. She saw life in its harsh beauty poetry, in its resilience. He now saw only a graveyard of memories. He blamed himself for her death. The official story was a random Apache raid, a band of renegades sweeping through while he was in Millfield for supplies. But the story, he told himself, was one of failure. He hadn't been there. He who had promised to protect her from the world had been miles away, buying flour and nails while she bled to death on the floor of their home. That failure had poisoned everything. After burying her, he had buried his past too. He took off the gun belt that had been a second skin for over a decade. He ignored the concerned glances of his neighbors, rebuffed their offers of food and company, and retreated into a self-imposed exile. He had made a promise at her grave, a desperate vow to a mound of fresh earth. He would honor her memory by becoming a man of peace. He would never again raise a hand in violence. He would protect the innocent, as she always had, with kindness and sanctuary, not with bullets. But it was a lie, a promise born of grief and guilt. He hadn't protected anyone. He had simply hidden, letting his world shrink to the borders of his blighted ranch. He had failed the most important person in his life, and in doing so had lost the right to protect anyone else. The man in the mirror was a stranger, a hollowed-out shell of the person Margaret had loved. The bank robbery had been a violent reminder of that truth. He had reacted, yes, but then he had frozen. He had let them ride away. The old instincts were still there, buried but not dead, and the shame of it burned hotter than the Arizona sun. A flicker of movement near the woodshed caught his eye. It was unnatural, a disruption in the familiar pattern of heat haze and circling hawks. He squinted, his senses long dormant sharpening with a painful rush. Two figures huddled in the sliver of shade behind the shed. Women. Their dresses were torn and grimy, their posture coiled with fear. They kept glancing toward the main road, their movements frantic and desperate. He stood his joints protesting. Every instinct screamed that this was trouble he didn't want. He should go inside, bolt the door, and pretend he hadn't seen them. It was the safe thing to do, the path his grief had charted for him. But then one of the women looked up, her gaze sweeping across the ranch yard, and for a heart-stopping moment, her eyes met his. There was no surprise in them, only a desperate, calculated plea. They weren't hiding from him. They were waiting for him. As Thorn approached, the dry earth crunching under his boots, the two women rose from their crouch. The older one, perhaps 20, stood protectively in front of the younger, who couldn't have been more than 17. They were bruised and exhausted, their faces streaked with dirt and tears. But there was a core of steel in their stances that belied their condition. "Help us," the older one said, her voice a ragged whisper. The words were a plea, but her eyes held a challenge. "Please. He's coming." "Who's coming?" Thorn asked, his voice rough from disuse. He stopped a dozen paces away, keeping his hands visible. Ambrose Kelly, the younger girl breathed, and the name hung in the air, like a death sentence. Kelly. The name was whispered all over the territory. A man who dealt in land freight and secrets, who had his hands in everything and left a trail of ruined lives in his wake. "What business do you have with a man like Kelly?" We were part of his recruitment," the older girl Sabrina said, the word dripping with venom. "He finds girls with no family, no prospects, promises them good work as maids or seamstresses in California. But it's a lie." Her sister Callie shuddered. "It's an auction. He sells us. To men with money and appetites." The last word was choked with horror. Thorn felt a familiar, sickening chill. This was the kind of evil he had once fought, the kind of darkness Margaret had believed could be countered by good men. He looked from their terrified faces to the empty road. The promise he had made to his wife, the one he had broken every day for 2 years, echoed in his conscience. "Protect the innocent." "We escaped from a holding house 2 nights ago," Sabrina continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "We've been running ever since. Pastor William, in Millfield, he told us to come here. He said you were a good man. He said you'd help." Pastor William. The kindly old man who had officiated his wedding and spoken at Margaret's funeral. The only person left in Millfield Thorn considered a friend. The distant sound of approaching horses broke the stillness. Not one rider, but a group moving at a steady, predatory pace. The sisters flinched as if struck. "It's them," Callie whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "They found us." Sabrina grabbed Thorn's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Please, mister, you're our only chance." Thorn's mind was a whirlwind. Helping them meant bringing Ambrose Kelly and his particular brand of violence down on this ranch, this last sanctuary of Margaret's memory. It meant breaking his vow of peace completely and irrevocably. But turning them away meant sending them back to a fate worse than death. It would be the final, ultimate betrayal of everything Margaret had stood for. As Kelly's posse crested the rise a half-mile down the road, the sun glinted off something familiar. Thorn's blood ran cold. The lead rider, flanking a well-dressed man who could only be Kelly, was the same man from the bank. The man with the cruel eyes and the silver-inlaid gun belt. The man who had stolen his locket. The world snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. This was no longer an abstract choice between a broken promise and the fate of two strangers. The man who had violated his wife's memory was riding toward his home to inflict more evil. The fight was no longer just about them. It was about Margaret. It was about reclaiming the last shattered piece of his life from the hands of the men who sought to destroy everything pure in the world. The rage he had felt in town, a flash flood of impotent fury, returned as a cold, steady current. The ghost was gone. Thorne Shepard, the man who had promised his wife he would protect the innocent, was back. "The root cellar," he said, his voice hard and clear. "Behind the house, there's a bolt on the inside. Don't open it for anyone but me." The riders fanned out as they entered his property, their movements practiced and unnervingly silent. Ambrose Kelly dismounted in the center of the yard, moving with the fluid grace of a panther. He was handsome in a severe way, with intelligent, cold eyes that missed nothing. He took in the sagging fence, the overgrown garden, the general air of decay, and a faint, knowing smile touched his lips. The man with the silver-inlaid belt, his face still bruised from Thorne's attack in town, stood at Kelly's right hand. He looked at Thorne, and a flicker of recognition, followed by pure malice, lit his eyes. "Thorne Shepard Kelly," said, his voice smooth as polished riverstone. It wasn't a question. "I'm Ambrose Kelly. I believe you've met my associate, Mr. Jones." "He's trespassing," Thorne said, his body tense as a coiled spring. "So are you." Kelly chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "A mere misunderstanding, I assure you. We're looking for some misplaced property. Two young women. They wandered off from one of my work camps, sentimental creatures prone to hysterics." His eyes swept the ranch, lingering on the main house, the barn, the woodshed. "I have reason to believe they came this way. You wouldn't have seen them, would you? This is a big territory. Girls get lost all the time." Kelly's smile tightened. He took a step closer, his gaze turning sharp and penetrative. He was sizing Thorne up, and Thorne could feel the unnerving weight of his scrutiny. "Yes, but these girls are special. And they took something that doesn't belong to them. A ledger. Bad for business." He paused, his eyes flicking toward the small, lovingly tended grave marker on the hill behind the house. "It's a lonely place out here. Must have been hard on you, losing your wife. Margaret, wasn't it? Such a terrible tragedy. That Apache raid." The casual mention of her name from this man's lips felt like a desecration. A cold dread crept up Thorne's spine. How did Kelly know her name? Why was he using it now? "You'd do well to keep my wife's name out of your mouth," Thorne warned, the words like chips of ice. No disrespect intended. Kelly said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "I admire a man who honors his family. I understand she was a pillar of the community. Always helping strays, wasn't she, taking in those who had nowhere else to go? A noble sentiment. You must be very proud." It was a psychological attack, deliberate and cruel. Kelly was using Margaret's memory as a weapon, twisting her goodness into a tool to mock and torment him. He was probing, looking for a weakness, and he had found the rawest one. "Get off my land, Kelly." "In a moment," Kelly said. He gestured to his men. "Search the property. Be thorough." As two men moved toward the house, Thorne stepped in their path. "I don't think so." Kelly sighed, a theatrical display of disappointment. "Mr. Shepard, I am trying to be reasonable. I know about you. I know about the promise you made at her grave. A vow of peace. How noble. But let me ask you, what would your sainted Margaret think of you harboring runaways and thieves, of letting them draw violence down on this home she loved so dearly?" The siege had begun, but it wasn't just one of guns. It was a siege on his soul. As Kelly's men spread out flanking him, Thorne backed slowly toward the house. His rifle was inside over the mantel, but the odds were impossible. It was him against 5, and he hadn't faced odds like that in years. He was rusty. He could feel it in the slight tremor in his hands, in the way his heart hammered against his ribs. Suddenly, a lamp crashed through the kitchen window, shattering on the porch. A moment later, a burning rag followed, landing in the pool of spilled oil. Flames erupted with a hungry whoosh, creating a wall of fire and thick, black smoke between Thorne and 2 of Kelly's men. From an upstairs window, a small, dark object flew through the air, a heavy cast-iron skillet, and caught Mr. Jones square in the temple. He crumpled to the ground without a sound. "The cellar," a voice shouted from inside the house. It was Sabrina. "They're in the cellar." It was a brilliant diversion. While 2 of Kelly's men were trapped by the fire and 1 was unconscious, the remaining 2, along with Kelly himself, rushed to the back of the house, drawn by the false cry. Thorne didn't hesitate. He vaulted over the porch railing, landing in a crouch, and sprinted for the barn. Inside, mounted on the wall, was his old Winchester. He grabbed at his fingers, finding the familiar grooves in the stock. The weight of it was a comfort, a grim homecoming. He emerged from the barn, just as Kelly's men were kicking open the root cellar doors. Thorne leveled the rifle, the iron sights settling on the back of a man, aiming his pistol into the dark opening. Thorne's finger tightened on the trigger, but he hesitated. A clean shot, an easy shot, a killing shot. The promise he made to Margaret screamed in his head. In that moment of hesitation, the man turned. He saw Thorne and fired. The bullet ripped through the sleeve of Thorne's shirt, burning a hot line along his forearm. The pain snapped him out of his paralysis. He fired back, not aiming for the chest, but for the leg. The shot was clumsy, a product of his rust and reluctance. It missed the leg, but struck the man's pistol, sending it spinning from his hand with a metallic clang. The other man spun around, but before he could fire, Sabrina appeared at the back door of the house, wielding a fireplace poker like a spear. She jabbed it hard into the back of his knee, and he went down with a howl of pain. Kelly stood alone, looking from his downed men to Thorne, then to Sabrina. His handsome face was contorted in a mask of cold fury. He hadn't expected a fight. He certainly hadn't expected this. "This changes nothing, Shepard," he roared. "You can't hide them forever." He drew his own pistol, a silver-plated Colt, and fired toward the house. Thorne returned fire, the bullet chewing up the dirt at Kelly's feet. The exchange was messy, desperate. A dance of missed shots and frantic reloading. Thorne could feel his age, the stiffness in his shoulders, and the years of disuse dulling his edge. But the sisters were not helpless. From the kitchen, Callie began banging pots and pans together, creating a disorienting racket that echoed across the ranch. Sabrina, using the poker, kept the man on the ground from retrieving his weapon. They were a team, resourceful and brave. Kelly, realizing he had lost the advantage, began to back away toward his horse, firing as he went. "This is your last chance. Give me the girls and the ledger, and I'll forget this ever happened. The only thing you'll get is a piece of lead if you don't ride out now," Thorne yelled back, chambering another round. With a final curse, Kelly mounted his horse. The remaining conscious man scrambled up behind him. They galloped away, leaving their 2 comrades, one unconscious one, nursing a shattered hand behind in the dust. The siege was over, but Thorne knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the war had just begun. The silence that descended after Kelly's departure was heavier than before, thick with the smell of smoke and the coppery tang of blood. Thorne bound the hands and feet of the 2 men. Kelly had abandoned his movements, methodical and detached. One was still unconscious. The other the man whose hand he'd shot whimpered and cursed him in equal measure. He dragged them into the barn and barred the door. Sabrina and Callie emerged from the house, their faces smudged with soot, but their eyes bright with adrenaline and relief. "You were good." Thorne said the praise, feeling inadequate. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" "You learn fast when your life depends on it," Sabrina replied, her gaze distant. "Our father was a Union captain. He didn't raise his daughters to be helpless." Thorne nodded, dabbing at the bloody furrow on his arm with a piece of his torn shirt. "Pastor William, you said he sent you here." "He did," Callie confirmed. "He's been helping girls escape Kelly for years. He told us if we could get the ledger and make it to your ranch, you would know what to do." "Then that's where we go," Thorne said, his decision solidifying. "Kelly will be back, and he'll bring more men. We can't stay here. We take this evidence to the pastor, and then we get it to the law." The journey to Millfield was a tense, silent affair. They took the winding canyon trails, avoiding the main road. Thorne rode his sturdiest stallion with Callie seated behind him. Sabrina, a surprisingly capable rider, handled the spare mare. The setting sun painted the sky in brutal shades of orange and purple, casting long, menacing shadows that seemed to claw at them from every direction. They arrived in Millfield under the cover of darkness. The town was quiet, the windows of the houses dark, save for a few glowing yellow squares. The church stood silhouetted against the starry sky, its steeple a dark finger pointing toward heaven. It should have been a place of sanctuary. Tonight, it felt like a tomb. An unnatural stillness hung over the grounds. No lamp burned in the pastor's office window, a rare occurrence. Thorne dismounted, handing the reins to Sabrina. "Stay here. Keep watch." He moved toward the small parish house adjoining the church, his boots silent in the dust. The front door was slightly ajar. A cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. Pastor William was a meticulous man. He never left his door unlocked. He pushed the door open. The room was dark, filled with the cloying, sweet smell of pipe tobacco and something else. Something metallic and wrong. He fumbled for the lantern on the wall and struck a match. The flame flared to life, casting flickering shadows across a scene of brutal finality. Pastor William lay on the floor behind his desk, his kind face frozen in an expression of surprise and pain. His Bible lay open beside him, a dark stain spreading across the pages of the Psalms. Thorne's breath caught in his throat. He had been too late. Kelly or someone working for him had gotten here first. The hope that had begun to kindle within him died, replaced by a cold, hard fury. They had lost their only ally. They were alone. He forced himself to move to think. He knelt beside the pastor, a silent prayer on his lips, before his eyes began to scan the office. The room had been tossed. Books were pulled from shelves, papers scattered across the floor. Kelly's men had been looking for something, the ledger, but the sisters still had it. "What is it?" Sabrina's voice came from the doorway. She and Callie stood there, their faces pale in the lantern light, as they took in the terrible scene. Callie let out a small, muffled sob. "They were looking for what you took," Thorne said grimly, pushing aside his own grief to focus on the task at hand. "Which means they don't have it. We need to see what else they missed." He began to search the room more carefully, looking past the obvious chaos. The pastor had been a man of secrets, Thorne now realized. A man fighting a lonely war. He would have been careful. He would have had a contingency. Behind a framed portrait of the pastor's late wife, Thorne's fingers found a loose board in the wall. He pried it open. Inside was a small hidden compartment. It contained a stack of coded letters and a second smaller ledger. This one wasn't filled with names of trafficked girls, but with financial transactions, shipping routes, and cryptic notes. He scanned the pages, his heart pounding. The pastor had been building his own case, corroborating the evidence from Kelly's ledger. But it was a single page of notes near the back that made Thorne freeze. It was titled, Railroad Land Acquisitions, MS Inquiry. He read the lines, his blood turning to ice. MS asking about railroad land grants, questions about deeds near southern border of her property. Too sharp, too curious. That talk of a special authorization, a silver seal used for sensitive cargo shipments. MS overheard a conversation. She's getting too close. Kelly worried about MS. Says she's a problem that needs to be handled before the new routes are finalized. MS Margaret Shepard. It wasn't a random raid. Thorne felt the floor drop out from under him. The world tilted on its axis. His wife's death hadn't been a tragic accident. She had been investigating. She had discovered something about Kelly and the railroad, something they were willing to kill to protect. The Apache raid had been a convenient lie to hide a cold-blooded murder. He had spent 2 years blaming himself for not being there, drowning in guilt for a random act of violence. But the truth was infinitely worse. Margaret hadn't been a victim of chance. She had been a target. She had been silenced. And the man responsible was Ambrose Kelly. The grief in his heart curdled into something harder, something colder and more dangerous than anything he had ever felt before. This was no longer just about justice for 2 escaped girls. It was about vengeance for his wife. "Thorne, what is it?" Sabrina asked, seeing the look on his face. He held up the ledger, his hands shaking with suppressed rage. "It's about my wife," he said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "It's always been about my wife." The pastor's ledger was a map into the heart of Kelly's darkness. One entry stood out, a scheduled transfer at a remote railroad depot called Black Creek Junction, a place that existed for no other reason than to serve the freight lines cutting through the territory. The manifest listed perishable goods. Private contract authorized by a silver seal stamp. It was happening tonight. It was their only lead. They rode hard, the 3 of them, a desperate posse fueled by vengeance and fear. Black Creek Junction was little more than a water tower, a small station house, and a few auxiliary tracks, branching off the main line, swallowed by the immense darkness of the plains. A single train sat idle on a siding, a plume of steam rising from its engine into the cold night air. Lanterns cast pools of jaundiced light around a single boxcar, where men were loading heavy, unmarked crates. Thorne left the sisters hidden in a rocky outcrop overlooking the depot, the Winchester, in Sabrina's steady hands. "If this goes wrong, you ride," he ordered. "Take the ledgers and get them to the nearest federal marshal. Don't stop for anything." He circled around, moving through the shadows like a wraith. The man he had been, the skills he had tried to bury, came back to him with a grim, effortless familiarity. He slipped aboard the train at the caboose, moving silently through the empty cars until he reached the one being loaded. He peered through a crack in the door. It wasn't crates they were loading. It was women. Huddled together, drugged and docile, their faces pale and terrified in the lantern light. Ambrose Kelly stood on the platform overseeing the operation. The sight of him so calm and businesslike as he trafficked human souls ignited the cold rage in Thorne's chest. He slipped out of the train on the opposite side and came around the front of the engine, using the massive machine as cover. He stepped out from behind the steam engine, his Colt steady in his hand. Kelly. The name cut through the night. The loading crew froze. Kelly turned slowly, his expression shifting from surprise to a cold reptilian amusement. "Shepard," he said, his voice calm. "I must confess, you are proving to be far more resilient than your dilapidated ranch would suggest. Have you come to return my property?" He gestured toward the boxcar. "I've come for you," Thorne said. "You murdered my wife." The accusation hung in the air. The loading crew exchanged nervous glances. Kelly's smile didn't falter. It widened. "Ah," he said, as if solving a puzzle. "You found the good pastor's homework. A pity. He was a sentimental old fool." He took a step forward into the light, his hands spread wide. "You have it all wrong. I didn't just happen upon your land. I didn't just stumble into your life. I sought it out. I sought you out." Thorne's finger tightened on the trigger. Kelly's face for the first time twisted with a raw, genuine emotion. It was hatred pure and ancient. Because of her. Because of Margaret. He spat her name like a curse. "You see, you didn't just marry a simple schoolteacher shepherd. You married Margaret Kelly, my sister." The word struck Thorne with the force of a physical blow. Sister Margaret had never spoken of a brother. She had told him her family was gone lost to sickness years ago. "Liar," Thorne breathed. "Oh, it's the truth," Kelly sneered, his voice dripping with years of festering resentment. "The golden child. The one our father adored. When he died, he left everything to her. The land the railroad shares the family name. And what did he leave me? Nothing. A pittance and a lecture on my untrustworthy character." He disinherited his own son in favor of his precious daughter. He began to pace his movements, agitated, a predator reliving an old wound. She was supposed to share it. That was the deal. But then she met you, a gunslinger with a past, trying to reinvent himself as a humble rancher. She fell for your act, hook, line, and sinker. She chose you over her own blood. She gave you everything that was rightfully mine. My land, my legacy, my fortune. Thorne stared, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman he loved with this monstrous narrative. It couldn't be true. "This whole operation," Kelly said, gesturing to the train, to the depot, to the vast dark land around them, "is built on the foundations of what she stole from me. I used the railroad our family built to run my business. I used the land that should have been mine for my transfers. It's not just about profit, Shepherd. It's about poetry. It's about taking the legacy she stole from me and twisting it into something that would make her sainted spirit curdle." He reached into his coat pocket. Thorne's gun came up, his aim steady. But Kelly didn't draw a weapon. He drew the silver locket. It dangled from his fingers, catching the lantern light. "Her death," Kelly's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "That was business. She started digging into my affairs. Her father's daughter, after all, always so righteous. She was a threat that needed to be neutralized. But you are personal. Every moment you lived on my land with my inheritance was an insult. I wanted you to suffer as I suffered, to lose everything just as I did." He held the locket up, Margaret's stained portrait facing Thorne. "This is all that's left of your stolen dream, Shepherd. And now I'm going to take it from you just before I take your life." The fight was no longer about justice. It wasn't even about vengeance. It had become a war over the soul of the woman they had both, in their own twisted ways, loved and lost. It was a battle between the man she chose and the brother she had abandoned, played out over a grave of shattered promises and stolen legacies. Kelly's confession had changed the equation. The rage in Thorne's heart now had a face, a name, a history. As Kelly's men started to move, spreading out to flank him, a rifle shot cracked from the rocks above. One of the men cried out and clutched his shoulder, his pistol falling to the dirt. Sabrina was watching their backs. The diversion gave Thorne the opening he needed. He fired not at Kelly, but at the lantern hanging by the boxcar door. It exploded, plunging half the platform into darkness and chaos. He dove behind a stack of barrels as return fire splintered the wood around him. The train, Kelly roared to his men. "Get the train moving now." The engine hissed, and with a great groan of metal, the train began to lurch forward. Thorne knew he couldn't let it leave. The women in that car would be lost forever. He broke cover, firing at the men near the engine, forcing them to duck. He sprinted alongside the accelerating train, his eyes fixed on the boxcar. He holstered his Colt, took a running leap, and grabbed hold of the iron ladder on the side of the car, swinging his body aboard. He scrambled onto the roof, just as another rifle shot from Sabrina took out a second man on the platform. Looking back, he saw Kelly, his face a mask of fury, making his own jump for the last car, the caboose. He was coming after him. The train picked up speed, plunging into the blackness of the open prairie. Thorne made his way precariously along the swaying roof of the boxcar toward the engine. He had to stop the train. But as he reached the coal car, a figure emerged from the engine cab, the engineer, a hulking man with a shovel in his hands. He swung it like a club, and Thorne had to drop flat to avoid being decapitated. The fight on the roof was a brutal, clumsy affair. The engineer was strong, but Thorne was faster. He used the man's momentum against him, sidestepping another wild swing and shoving him off balance. The engineer tumbled from the roof with a cry, vanishing into the darkness below. Thorne dropped into the engine cab. The fireman looked up, his eyes wide with terror, and immediately surrendered. "I don't want no trouble, mister." "Then uncouple the engine," Thorne ordered. As the fireman scrambled to work the release mechanism, Thorne looked back. Kelly was making his way along the rooftops toward him, moving with surprising agility. There was a loud clang as the engine disconnected from the rest of the train. The boxcar and caboose began to slow coasting on their momentum, while Thorne and the fireman pulled ahead on the freed engine. He had saved the women, but Kelly was still on that train, and the Ledgers were still with the sisters back at the depot. He had to go back. They returned to find the junction in chaos. Sabrina and Callie had come down from the rocks, and using Thorne's remaining prisoner as a shield, had gotten the drop on Kelly's last two men. But Kelly was nowhere to be found. He had slipped away into the darkness when the train cars had rolled to a stop. "He's gone," Sabrina said, her rifle still trained on the captured men. But he told them something before he ran. The biggest shipment, the one Pastor William wrote about, is leaving from the main depot in Prescott tomorrow. A private train, straight to California. "We have to stop it." Callie said, her voice firm. "This is our only chance to get them all." They had won the battle at Black Creek, but the real war lay ahead. They needed help. The telegraph office in Millfield, Thorne said, "If we can get a message to the U.S. Marshals in Prescott, we might have a chance." They tied up their prisoners and left them with the rescued women, who were slowly beginning to stir from their drugged stupor. The ride back to Millfield was a race against the dawn. They found the telegraph office dark. The night operator, a man named Henderson, whom Thorne had known for years, looked up in surprise. "Thorne, what in God's name are you doing here at this hour?" "I need you to send a message," Jed Thorne said quickly, explaining the situation, omitting the most personal details. "It's a matter of life and death." Henderson, a fundamentally decent man, looked pale, but nodded, his fingers flying across the telegraph key as Thorne dictated the urgent message. As the coded message clicked its way across the wires, a sense of hope returned. "They'll meet you at Devil's Pass," Henderson said, reading the reply. "It's the only bridge for 50 miles. They can stop the train there, but you have to lead them. They don't know Kelly's operation like you do." He gave Thorne a piece of paper with a route marked on it. "Take this shortcut through Red Rock Canyon. It'll save you hours. You can get ahead of the train." Thorne thanked him, and they left hope warring with exhaustion. The shortcut was a treacherous, narrow path, barely wide enough for a single horse. As they rounded a sharp bend, the canyon walls rising steeply on either side, Thorne pulled his horse to a sudden halt. Ahead of them, blocking the path, stood the Millfield deputy, a man named Calloway. And behind him were 4 men with rifles. Ambrose Kelly stepped out from behind a boulder, a cruel smile on his face. In his hand, he held a length of cut telegraph wire. "Your message never got through," Shepherd Kelly said conversationally. "Mr. Henderson, like so many in this territory, understands the value of my patronage. He let me know you were coming. It was a foolish plan. Trusting people. It's what got my sister killed. And now it's going to get you killed." The trap had been sprung. The friendly face in town was a mole. Their desperate plea for help had been a message to their executioner. They were cornered, outnumbered, with the clock ticking down to the departure of a train full of innocent women. There was no escape. The narrow canyon became a killing box. Gunfire erupted, the sound amplified by the rock walls into a deafening roar. Bullets ricocheted, whining like angry hornets. Thorne shoved the sisters off their horses, pulling them down behind the meager cover of a fallen rock. "We're pinned," Sabrina yelled over the din, chambering around into the Winchester. "They have the high ground." Kelly's men were positioned perfectly, firing down on them from the canyon rim. It was an ambush, plain and simple. Kelly's voice echoed down, laced with triumphant mockery. "This is the end of the line, Shepherd, a pathetic end for the man who stole my family's name." Desperation clawed at Thorne. He was out of options. But as another volley of shots kicked up dust around them, Callie grabbed his arm. "The rock slide," she shouted, pointing to a section of the canyon wall above Kelly's men. It was a precarious ledge littered with loose scree and balanced boulders, a collapse waiting to happen. Our father taught us about demolitions. If we can create a shockwave. It was a mad gamble. Thorne looked at the unstable rock face and then at the rifle in his hands. He needed a precise shot, something to hit the key pressure point. While Sabrina laid down covering fire, forcing Kelly's men to keep their heads down, Thorne took aim. He breathed out slowly, the world narrowing to the front sight of his Colt. The lessons of 100 gunfights, the instincts he had tried to suppress, all came flooding back. He squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck a large, flat rock near the base of the overhang. Nothing happened. He fired again. A spider web of cracks appeared. He fired a third time. With a deep groan that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth, the ledge gave way. An avalanche of rock and dirt thundered down the canyon wall, burying 2 of Kelly's men and forcing the others to scramble for their lives. The ambush was broken. In the ensuing chaos of dust and shouting, Kelly and the surviving men retreated, their advantage lost. They didn't have time to celebrate. The train, Thorne said, his voice raw. "We have to get to Devil's Pass." They rode with a desperate urgency, pushing their horses to their limits. As they neared the pass, the wind began to pick up, carrying with it the gritty taste of dust. On the horizon, a monstrous brown cloud was building a sandstorm. Devil's Pass was a deep, jagged scar in the earth, spanned by a single skeletal railroad bridge. The train was already approaching a black serpent against the dying light. There were no marshals. Their message had never been sent. They were on their own. Thorne reined in his horse at the edge of the gorge. "The bridge is our only chance. Sabrina, Callie, I need you to create a diversion. Draw their fire. I'm going to board that train." He raced his horse alongside the tracks, the wind whipping at his face. The sandstorm was rolling in fast, the sky turning a sickly yellow. Visibility was dropping with every second. He urged his horse faster, closing the distance to the train. With a final surge of strength, he leapt from the saddle, catching the ladder of a freight car just behind the engine. He climbed to the roof, the wind threatening to tear him from his perch. He could barely see 10 feet in front of him. The storm had hit. He made his way forward, fighting against the gale toward the private passenger car where Kelly would be. The door was locked. He fired 2 shots into the lock, the sound swallowed by the howling wind, and kicked it open. Ambrose Kelly stood inside the silver locket, swinging from one hand, a pistol in the other. Behind him, huddled in the opulent car, were more than a dozen young women, their faces masks of terror. "I knew you would come." Kelly screamed over the storm. One last dance, brother-in-law. The fight was brutal and primal. They crashed against the velvet seats and polished wood of the car, 2 men locked in a struggle fueled by years of hatred. The train swayed violently on the bridge, the gorge a terrifying unseen abyss just feet away. Thorne was stronger, but Kelly was fueled by a madman's fury. He fought with a desperate, vicious energy. They grappled, trading blows, the pistol forgotten. It was hand-to-hand, a raw contest of will. Thorne finally gained the upper hand, pinning Kelly against the open doorway of the swaying car. But Kelly, with a final desperate gambit, held up the locket, dangling it over the gorge. "Look, Shepherd," he snarled, his face contorted. "Your precious Margaret. You have a choice. Save her memory, or save them." He gestured with his head to the terrified women. Thorne stared at the locket, at the last piece of his wife, hanging by a thread between his past and his present. He saw her stained portrait, and for a moment, his obsession, his grief, threatened to consume him. He could lunge for it, save this last tangible connection to her. Then he looked past Kelly at the faces of the women on the train. He saw their fear, their desperation, the same innocence he had promised Margaret he would protect. And in that instant, he understood the true meaning of his vow. It wasn't about avenging her death or preserving her memory in silver and glass. It was about honoring her life by protecting the living. It was about letting go of the ghost that had haunted him to save the people who were still here. He let go. He met Kelly's triumphant gaze, and instead of lunging for the locket, he drove his fist into Kelly's face. The blow was clean and final. Kelly, stunned, lost his grip. The locket fell tumbling into the howling wind and vanishing into the gorge below. At the same time, Thorne shoved Kelly with all his might. With a scream of rage and disbelief, Ambrose Kelly toppled backward out of the open door, swallowed by the sandstorm and the blackness of Devil's Pass. Thorne stood there, breathing heavily, the wind tearing at his clothes. He had done it. He had let her go. And in doing so, he had finally truly kept his promise. The sandstorm abated as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world scoured clean and unnervingly quiet. Thorne brought the train to a halt just past the bridge. He moved through the passenger car, offering quiet words of reassurance to the rescued women. They were frightened and bewildered, but they were safe. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, a group of riders appeared. They weren't a posse. They moved with military precision, and the sun glinted off the federal stars pinned to their vests. They were led by a woman in her 50s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 harsh trials. Sabrina and Callie were with them. They ran to Thorne, relief washing over their faces. "We found them," Sabrina explained. "A patrol 10 miles east." We told them everything. The lead marshal dismounted and approached Thorne, her expression unreadable. "Thorne Shepherd. I'm Marshal Catherine Webb. You've had a busy night." "Ambrose Kelly is gone," Thorne said simply. "He fell from the bridge." Webb nodded, unsurprised. "We've been hunting Kelly's network for the better part of a year. It's a vast operation with roots that go deep. We could never get close enough to the man at the top. Until now." She looked over at the sisters, a flicker of pride in her eyes. These two are the best undercover deputies I've ever had. Thorne looked from Sabrina to Callie, comprehension dawning. Their skill, their courage, their uncanny ability to think under fire, it all made sense. They weren't victims. They were lawmen. "You did well, deputies," Webb said to them, then turned her attention back to Thorne. "There's something else you need to know. The reason deputies Weber were assigned to this territory, the reason we started looking at Kelly in the first place, it was because of our original informant." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "Your wife, Mr. Shepard. Margaret was working for us." The world, which had just begun to settle, tilted once more. Margaret, an informant, a federal agent. She was a schoolteacher. Thorne said the words, feeling foolish as he spoke them. She was Webb confirmed, and she used that position to gather information. She noticed things others missed: the suspicious land deals, the secretive railroad shipments, the young women who passed through town and were never seen again. She contacted us 2 years ago. The intelligence she provided was the foundation of this entire case. She kept her work a secret to protect you, Thorne. She knew the danger. She knew what men like Kelly were capable of. Webb reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a leather-bound journal. Thorne recognized it instantly. It was Margaret's. "We found it where she hid it in the root cellar, just as her last letter instructed," Webb said, handing it to him. "She documented everything. Her investigation and her love for you. She wanted you to have it, should the truth ever come out." With trembling hands, Thorne opened the journal. Her elegant script filled the pages, detailing not just observations, but coded reports, names of corrupt officials, and schedules for Kelly's shipments. She had been fighting a secret war right under his nose. He turned to the last entry, dated the day before her death. "My dearest Thorne," she had written, "if you are reading this, then my secrets have found their way into the light, and I am gone. Please do not mourn the life I kept from you. I did it only to shield you from this darkness. I know the man you were, and I feared this fight would call him back, risking the beautiful peace we built together. But know this, my greatest faith was never in the law or in my own abilities. It was in your goodness. You are the best man I have ever known. Your promise to protect the innocent is not a burden of my making. It is the truth of who you are. Live in the light, my love. Continue the work. My love is with you always." Tears streamed down Thorne's face, washing away 2 years of guilt and misunderstanding. He hadn't failed her. She hadn't died because he was absent. She had died a soldier's death, fighting for what was right. The weight that had crushed his soul for so long finally lifted. He was free. He finally understood the depth of her sacrifice, and in that understanding, he forgave himself. Months later, the land was healing, and so was Thorne. The trafficking ring had been utterly dismantled. Corrupt officials from Millfield to Sacramento were in federal prison. The newspapers called it the largest criminal conspiracy in the history of the territories. To Thorne, it was simply the end of Margaret's war. He had restored the ranch, but it was no longer a monument to grief. The fences were mended, the garden bloomed with Margaret's wildflowers, and the house was filled with light. But it was more than just a home now. It was a sanctuary. Working with Marshal Webb, Thorne had turned the property into a key stop on a new network, a system for helping people escape danger run by the marshals. The root cellar, once a place of secrets, now held supplies for travelers seeking refuge. Margaret's work continued. One crisp autumn afternoon, the Weber sisters rode in. They were no longer disguised as frightened runaways, but wore their deputy marshal stars with pride. They were stopping by on their way to a new assignment in Colorado. "The place looks good," Sabrina said, surveying the vibrant, thriving ranch. "It feels alive again," he replied, and the words were true. As they prepared to leave, Callie hesitated. "We have something for you," she said, reaching into her saddlebag. "One of the surveyors found it in the gorge below the bridge. It's a miracle it survived." She held out her hand. Resting in her palm was the silver locket. It was scratched and dented from the fall, but it was intact. Thorn took it, his fingers closing around the familiar worn metal. For a long moment, he said nothing. He could put the leather cord back on, wear it as he always had. He could keep her memory pressed against his heart. But as he looked at the locket, he knew he no longer needed it. Her memory wasn't trapped in a silver oval anymore. It was in the blooming flowers, in the safety of the house, in the purpose he had found. He walked with them to the small hill behind the house, to Margaret's grave. The simple wooden cross had been replaced by a handsome stone marker. He didn't open the locket. He didn't need to see the stained portrait inside. He simply placed it on the headstone, letting the silver gleam in the afternoon sun. It was an offering, a final act of letting go of his grief while honoring everything she was. He looked out at the horizon, at the blood-red mesas that no longer seemed like judges, but like ancient, silent witnesses. He was not the broken man who had hidden from the world. He was Margaret's husband, a man with a renewed purpose, continuing the work she had so bravely begun. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, he walked back to the house and lit the lamp in the window. It shone brightly in the gathering twilight, a beacon of hope in the untamed west.